So you've made it towards the end. This is our eighth module and the final one for Chapter 6 on the self. And we've been talking about various forms of identity. Our last module was on gender and identity. And now we're going to focus on ethnic identity. And one aspect of the growing capacity for self-reflection in adolescents who are members of ethnic minorities is this kind of sharpened awareness of what it means for them to be a member of a minority group. So adolescents, compared to, say, children, are much more acutely aware of prejudices and stereotypes that others may hold about ethnic groups. And so Gene Finney, back in 1990, went ahead and created this kind of levels of assimilation or levels of awareness of ethnicity and put it into four major ways that ethnic minority groups respond. And so that's what we'll see here on the next slide. So as you can see here, this is a combination of identification with high identification with the major cultural group or the majority culture, and then a high or low identification with ethnic group. And based on that kind of matrix, you can go ahead and see how each one lines up. So let's go ahead and start off with those who are low identity in their ethnic group, but high identity with the majority culture, or what's referred to as assimilation. Okay, and so in other words, this is when you say you've assimilated, this is somebody of the ethnic minority who has left behind their own ethnic group values and adopted those of the more majority culture. Now, those who tend to go the assimilated route tend to have a little higher levels of self-esteem, but obviously do feel somewhat distanced from their ethnic group. The next one is where you have low identification with ethnic group and low identification with the majority culture. And in that case, we call that marginality. And that is, in many cases, where you don't feel like you belong anywhere. You tend to see that at a higher rate among Native Americans, usually due to a very long history of where their ethnic culture was kind of wiped out and they were encouraged to assimilate. However, the white culture at the time rejected that attempt at assimilation, so they felt like they were neither place. Once again, these are very broad generalities as far as where a particular ethnic group may fit in. Every individual is going to be different. So now let's look at those who have low majority culture identification, but high identification with ethnic group. And that is called separated. And separated is where you just associate with members of your own ethnic group and you reject the ways of the majority culture. You tend to see that pattern more highly among African Americans than other ethnic groups. It's kind of a common theme there. And as you can imagine, if you reject the majority group of a society, it does lead to some issues as far as being able to fit in and have as many opportunities as you may have been exposed to later on. And then the final one of these is the bicultural identity, where you identify highly with both the majority culture and your ethnic group. And that is dual identity is one view of strength. And in those ethnic groups that you see this, it tends to be more Mexican American and Asian Americans that have this pattern more so. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Well, before we do that, let's go ahead and talk about hybrid identity. And that is integrating elements of various cultures, including both local and global culture. As you can imagine, and you may say that some of the majority culture of the United States has definitely done this because things like having various ethnic foods has been viewed as very mainstream now. It's not odd for people to have Thai food one day, Mexican food the next, and then hamburgers the next day. And that is kind of a hybrid identity as far as maybe the food choices that you make or the holidays that you celebrate or things like that. And we do see that's increasingly more common as you see the influence of more of a global culture. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide here because the next slide is going to get at some examples. And as you can see here, it's pretty much consistent with what I was talking about on the last slide. So bicultural. Here's an example. Being both Mexican and American is the best of both worlds. You have different strengths you can draw on in different situations. So they're borrowing from both sides of the majority and ethnic minority cultures. In assimilated, I don't really think of myself as Asian American, just as American. Okay, so once again, kind of casting off the ethnic identity and then just going and focusing on the majority culture. Separated, I'm not part of two cultures, I am just black. Okay, so that would be an example of somebody just identifying with their ethnic minority and not acknowledging the majority culture. And then finally, marginal. When I'm with my Indian friends, I feel white, and when I'm with my white friends, I feel Indian. I don't really feel I belong with either of them. And so that shows that kind of isolation and distancing that some may feel who adopt that marginalized identity. So obviously, adolescents are going through quite a bit, especially who are of ethnic minority. So how does that go into emerging adulthood? And I think what we find is that it's a really important time in emerging adulthood in their development, because emerging adults are going into new contexts. And so it may force them to have a deeper sense of who they are. To the extreme, anybody who has gone abroad and gone in a culture that's very, very different from yourself, it does force you to have a better idea and really focus on who you are that you may not have done if you'd spent time just with the culture that you grew up with. And so emerging adulthood is going to have more of those type of experiences and a much more advanced type of identity development. So that was the last little area for our module on the self and self-formation. Hopefully you've been able to pick up on some of the major terms. And we'll go ahead and continue on Chapter 7 when we get back into class.